All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is D.W. Gibson, and I'm part of the team at Ideaspace. We're a 501c4 that strives for a fresh and even-handed portrayal of thought leaders and their ideas, and for bipartisan legislative action in support of the most promising of those ideas. We want to tackle some of the most intractable issues of our times, and so we've begun with immigration. You can check out all of our interviews, research, and analysis at ideaspace.com, including our most recent publication on the Bipartisan Temporary Family Visitation Act. Today, we return to the topic of border security. More specifically, what tools are available to the U.S. to address crises before they materialize at the border? And we welcome Ben Rohrbaugh to the Ideaspace Briefing series to help us address these questions. Mr. Rohrbaugh is part of the team at New Macro Risk, which is a developer of homeland security and emerging risk training products. He's also the co-founder of Lantern Unmanned Autonomous Systems, which develops systems to scan cargo containers using aerial drones. Ben brings years of academic and governmental experience to his work in the private sector. He's been a fellow at the Central America and Mexico Policy Initiative at the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas at Austin. He was previously a senior advisor in the Department of Homeland Security Office of Policy. And from 2014 to 2016, he served as the Director for Enforcement and Border Security at the National Security Council in the White House. He's also served as a senior advisor to the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection, with much of his work focusing on border management, cross-border infrastructure, and communications interoperability. We're glad to have you with us today, Ben. So feel free, please, to welcome, we welcome all your questions and your comments. For all those of you who have joined us today, feel free to use the chat feature to chime in with anything you'd like to introduce into the discussion. I'll start us off with a big picture question before we get more granular. Ben, I know New Macro Risk, as the name implies, takes a look at the big picture. And with that in mind, I wonder, what are some of the concerns around the world that you see affecting border security specifically? Perhaps some of the newer, less traditional risks that might not be so obvious.
Sure. So thank you so much, DW, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. I think what we are seeing, particularly in terms of driving migration, are so some of the risks that maybe have been prevalent in the past, but have changed in their intensity and in the way that they're directly affecting flows. We've seen certainly escalating natural disasters, right, causing sort of very direct consequences in terms of people wanting to move and needing to move from their homes. But we're also seeing an escalation in the way that transnational organized crime is affecting the decision of civilians to migrate. We see this particularly in Central America and also in places like Venezuela, where really extreme levels of danger to civilians are causing people and really challenges to national sovereignty are causing migrants to flee and claim asylum in ways that are really untraditional, what are really outside of the traditional pathways where people, face political persecution. And now it's very much a question of, or it's very frequently a question of people feeling unsafe in their communities because of gangs and organized crime, and a level that just generally hadn't been realized in the border in the past.
So, and you mentioned sort of national sovereignty there, and I know that makes me think of sort of like the post 9/11 framework, and I know that border security has changed a lot of the last couple of decades. 9/11 was a big watershed moment, right? That's where we sort of folded the idea of border security into sort of war on terror and militarization of the border. But it feels as though we've reached a sort of, if you will, post 9/11 stage, whereby the sort of go it alone approach feels a little bit inadequate for sort of the challenges that we're facing on a global scale. How do you think we might adjust this sort of post 9/11 framework that we've been using for the last couple of decades?
Sure. So it sort of specifically as it relates to the border, after 9/11, there was a huge focus on intercepting entries on the Southwest border, right? It was understood that we didn't have a complete sense of who might be crossing on the Southwest border. And so this possibility of a terrorist or a terrorist group entering through, in between the ports of entry and entering the United States without being detected was very, very prominent on policymakers' minds after 9/11 and as the Department of Homeland Security was being formed. It also, though, that coincided with a huge push on border security generally that had begun in the 1990s, where the Border Patrol had been doubled in the 1990s and then was doubled again in the early 2000s. And that was almost entirely focused on this problem of intercepting illicit migration at the southwest border. So people are crossing in between the legal ports of entry and trying to get around Border Patrol agents. And what we've seen now since 2013 is that problem has fundamentally changed. I'm sure as many folks here know well, where instead of having primarily Mexican migrants who are moving across the border and evading Border Patrol agents, we have much larger numbers of families, children, other vulnerable populations that are actually seeking out Border Patrol agents and claiming humanitarian protections, which is really an entirely different problem, and one where the structures of sensors and cameras and overhead drones and other things that were put in place after 9/11 to provide situational awareness on people crossing aren't as effective, because people are not, to a large extent, trying to evade apprehension, or if they are evading apprehension, they're actually enabled to do that better because Border Patrol agents are so busy handling sort of straightforward processing of people who are presenting themselves to them. So I think that what we've seen is that the border security enterprise that was constructed after 9/11, it was constructed in the 90s and then accelerated after 9/11, hasn't been the best fit for the challenges that we've really seen in the last just 8-9 years.
I think it's a really good, important point of distinction you've made there in terms of responsibilities eating up time of Border Patrol agents, where it's not so much about sort of surveillance and keeping an eye on land masses between ports of entry, but processing, right? This sort of bureaucratic work that they weren't doing nearly as much a few decades ago. I know that you work closely with Alan Burson in a few different capacities. He's involved with new macro risks, a former CBP commissioner, and he talks a lot about migration management and the idea that all of those tools that you just referenced in terms of drones and surveillance and barriers are part of managing the border, but that's really just one piece of border security. The other piece of it is what you've been sort of touching on here at the beginning of our conversation with taking a wider look at what we can do to intercept traffic before it gets to the border, right? I've heard him talk about the border is often misconstrued as a sort of first line of defense, when really it's a last line of interaction, right? There's so much that happens, as you've indicated here, before people get to the border. So with that idea of sort of migration management there in the center of things, I wonder if you could talk to that idea a little bit more. Migration management, what it means to you, and how you see it possibly playing out when it comes to border security policymaking.
Yeah, so that's a great point. That's a great segue. So migration management, a lot of these discussions about it can get very technical, right? People start talking about specific programs and different aspects of it, and should MPP and this and that, and it gets very quickly bogged down in technical details. But I think fundamentally, when we're thinking about migration management questions, we're thinking about people, and there are a few different things that need to be decided in order to have sort of solutions on this. And so that people need, as people are moving, their needs need to be met somehow, right? Either they're going to be fed and sheltered through some sort of formal mechanism, or they'll use informal mechanisms as they're traveling, right? They need some kind of legal, or they have some kind of legal status as they're moving through these migration pathways, whether it's whether it's an illegal status where they're not allowed to be somewhere, or whether they have some sort of temporary status or whatever it is, and they need some process where that could be adjudicated, right? And then finally, they need, if there's going to be some kind of migration enforcement, we need to determine where they're going to go. And I think what you were referencing in Alan's point is that when in the 1990s and the early 2000s, when the United States was dealing mostly with Mexican migration, those were pretty easy questions. When someone was removed, they were removed back to Mexico. The question of did they have legal status in the United States? No, and they didn't have they largely didn't have the ability to appeal for humanitarian protections in the United States. The question of how their needs were met, how they were sheltered, was entirely through informal mechanisms. You arrived at the border, maybe you paid a coyote. You would, if you managed to evade apprehension, you moved into informal employment networks, and suddenly you were working in one of these different industries like construction or restaurants or other things that really has used high levels of illegal labor in the United States. But what we're seeing now is that those questions, which were so simple or were so comparatively straightforward in the previous context, are much more complicated now. As we're having large numbers of Central Americans, we're seeing children, vulnerable populations, and increasingly in the last few years, we're seeing arrivals of migrants from places where we can't return people to, right? Like Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua, right? So places where just simply the question of where they go after some kind of legal determination of their status is made are entirely up in the air. And I think what that results in is that suddenly you need to start, or policymakers need to start thinking about migration far beyond just when migrants arrive at the southwest border, but they need to think of sort of the whole pathway that people get to the United States. And we've actually seen that. We saw it in the Obama administration and we saw it in the Trump administration, where despite very different pathways, they ended up settling on really similar solutions to the migration surges that they faced. And in both situations, it was to turn to the Mexican government. With the Obama administration, it was to turn to the Mexican government and ask them essentially to increase enforcement on Mexico's southern border with Guatemala and Belize. And in the Trump administration, it was to establish the migrant protection protocols, which put people in Mexico, but also to push the Mexican government to increase their enforcement with a threat of tariffs. So very different interactions with the Mexican government, but fundamentally it was a way to try and solve the problem outside of the United States, which is, I think, the core of what you're getting at, DW, is that suddenly these problems can't just be solved at the physical land border in the US.
Yeah, and you touched on the idea of these long journeys that a lot of migrants are making, hundreds, some cases thousands of miles. And I think something that often gets overlooked is the danger of that journey, right? And looking for ways to possibly shorten that journey or preempt that journey. And again, not just for two reasons. One, sort of to help the migrant not be put in danger's way, but also not to create chaos, right? It's sort of at the border in terms of large surges of people that we see in episodic fashion. And I know that when you and I first spoke, we were talking about it, I guess I might characterize as a semi-novel idea of regional processing centers, right? The notion that some of this work of making determinations of where a person can wind up could possibly happen before people reach the southern border. It'd be interesting to hear you sort of talk about that idea, sort of in broad strokes, sort of paint a picture of what it might look like, and the importance of perhaps of international cooperation in such an approach.
Yeah, sure. So I think that the core problem that we have to address, in which regional processing centers or something like that are a promising approach for, is that right now the United States effectively has two different immigration systems. There's one, if people arrive at the southwest border, where they're eligible for certain, they're eligible to make certain kind of claims for humanitarian protections that they wouldn't be able to make if they arrived at a consulate or went through any kind of formal process. And that obviously, like you said, has significant downsides in terms of what it means to manage migration, but also in terms of the incentives it creates for migrants to use, basically illicit pathways to the southwest border and subject themselves to all kinds of really awful treatment. But what that also then shows is that in order to move away from having sort of this separate informal migration system at the southwest border that's based on use of asylum claims, is that if we're able to provide a way, working with our partners in the region, for migrants to actually make claims for humanitarian protections, and for the people who do have very legitimate needs for those kind of protections to be safe while they go through some sort of expedited legal process, where they don't necessarily have to be waiting in the United States while that happens, that could be a way to, one, make the process more orderly, and make the process more orderly, prevent some of the problems we're seeing with just the overwhelming the existing systems in the southwest border, but also to provide access to humanitarian protections to the people who are most vulnerable. And I think what is often obscured here is the people who are most vulnerable in a place like Guatemala or El Salvador are not necessarily the people who are able to pay thousands of dollars for a smuggler to take them to the southwest border. It's often the people who don't have those kinds of resources. And so this question of, who are the people who are most in need of humanitarian protections, how we actually provide access to those, how we do that in the region, and how we can use that as a way to establish an orderly system that provides protections to people who genuinely deserve it, but at the same time doesn't create a sort of a separate informal immigration system that people can take advantage of, is really, I think, the core policy question that officials are grappling with in migration.
Well, one of the reasons I think the idea of a regional processing center is so appealing is because it sort of scrambles political positions, right? And it's hard to sort of have a sort of just a quick reaction to, right? Because on the one hand, it gives both parties, I think people across the political spectrum, something they're looking for. It saves people from sort of long, dangerous journeys, and it saves us from sort of potentially, for at least take some pressure off of some of the surges we see episodically at the border. And it also creates sort of a sense of shared responsibility, I think, sort of regionally in terms of addressing migration. So it can sort of alleviate some of the pressure that the US feels, I think, going at it alone, so to speak, right? And I also think there's some unexpected outcomes, and maybe if you could speak to those in terms of like things we don't consider when migrants are trying to find a place to live, in terms of language, in terms of cultural similarities, other choices they might have beyond just coming to the US, right? So maybe touch on that. And also, I think it's important for policymakers when sort of trying to consider these more novel ideas, to look at things that are already out there in the landscape that might provide some modeling. And I know there have been some very limited small programs, CAM and so forth, for minors, unaccompanied minors, but maybe talk to some models that are out there that could be looked at and maybe built up to sort of look at this idea of regional processing centers.
Sure. So yeah, I think this gets back to the point I made earlier about how we can either have sort of formal processes to meet migrants' needs as they're traveling, or you can have informal processes, and that's what we have now, and they're largely exploitative and bad, right? You don't want the situations that we're seeing where there's sort of informal camps or things like that, where they're overwhelming cities in Mexico. You don't want large. I mean, we've seen the pandemic. You don't want large areas where people don't have any access to medical care, right? Where there are sicknesses and other things can spread quickly. I mean, all of those things are fraught and dangerous and have all kinds of serious policy consequences. And what is interesting about a real regional approach to migration is that everyone doesn't necessarily have to end up in the United States in one of these models, right? You could have a situation where migrants who genuinely are fleeing danger in whichever country they're coming from, and who really merit humanitarian protections, could be, maybe some people could be placed in the United States, some people could be placed in other Spanish-speaking countries in the region, right? There may be people who would be safe and comfortable in Chile or wherever else, right? You'd have to work this out with foreign governments, and obviously they would need assistance as they're working to integrate these asylum seekers into their populations. But it's certainly achievable and doable. And I think that the converse of this is that the way we're doing things right now is about as expensive and burdensome as it could possibly be. When you look at expenditures on the southwest border, like what it means to quickly build shelters for DHS or Health and Human Services, what the way money is moving in these kind of things, it's an incredibly expensive and difficult process. And so if there were a way to be a little bit more thoughtful about it, to try and establish some kind of actual regional approach where people would genuinely have access to make humanitarian claims, but where people who were economic migrants wouldn't necessarily be able to wait in the United States for years while those claims are adjudicated, as they often are now. That kind of approach, I think, could really be valuable, and like you said, sort of gets away from some of the, I guess, previous sort of political scar tissue around this, because I mentioned both the Trump administration and the Obama administration turned to the Mexican government at some point, and they did it in very different tones, but that's where they ended up. And I think that's likely where we're going to continue ending up with these future crises, especially as we start seeing, populations arriving from sort of broader and broader geographic areas as we are now.
Yeah, and I think thank you for underscoring that, because I think that point that both the Obama administration and Trump administration, in effect, did the same thing, speaks to the reality that we're facing, and the reality that we've been talking about here, in terms of a need to address things in a sort of, again, not go it alone approach, a sort of more expansive approach. Let's talk a little bit about data too, because I know that there's a lot of perspective around sort of the importance of data and how it can inform border security, whether it's sort of an acute version of data in terms of images and sounds and movements captured at the border with some of the tools you mentioned at the outset of our conversation, but also data as it applies to migratory movements, right? So I don't know, just in broad strokes as an opening question on this topic, talk about sort of how you see data as an important tool when it comes to border security.
Yeah, so I'd say it's sort of in maybe two pieces. And so the first is that just complete sort of collecting all the getting situational awareness on the border has been actually just on the border has been an enormous challenge for the Department of Homeland Security and its predecessors. There's this major sort of famous acquisition initiative, the SBInet, right? The idea of this virtual border wall, which is like the case study you use in failed DHS acquisitions, that sort of shows how these networks of contractors and subcontractors, and eventually, all doing complicated things, don't work very well. And I think because of that, there's been a lot of resistance to comprehensive solutions on the southwest border, with the result that you generally have operators sort of in a piecemeal way using whatever works for them. And I think folks are often surprised. You go talk to DHS or CBP and say like, all right, show me the southwest border, and it's like, well, all right, give our folks a couple hours to come up with a presentation of it for you. It's not what you imagine, where you walk into like a boiler room and you can see everyone who's moving anywhere on in the border. And so that's an ongoing challenge, and one that I think their technological solutions exist, but ones that just haven't been applied quite as thoroughly as they need to be. But on top of that, there's this sort of much bigger challenge of figuring out what's going to happen in the future, and what data is sort of most relevant about where migration is going. And I've seen a number of different efforts to try and provide some kind of predictive indicators about what's going to happen with migration. I saw this when I was in government. I've seen it outside, and it's incredibly challenging because there's so many different things that can affect how people choose to migrate. And so what generally happens is folks will say, all right, well, we need some kind of model, right, to figure out what's going to drive people to come to the US. And they say, all right, well, natural disasters, right? People are going to want to migrate after some terrible disaster in their area. And that's sort of true, but then you'll have situations like the earthquake in Haiti, where there's an earthquake, people leave Haiti, but then they go to Brazil for a couple of years, and then it's a policy shift in the United States that actually results in large numbers of people, or a perceived policy shift in terms of removal flights that actually results in lots of people arriving in Del Rio. And how do you model that? Like, how do you model perceptions of policy changes or other things? And so this is a major challenge, and one that I wouldn't necessarily want to be the person who has to figure out, but it's one where as folks are making decisions about how resources are allocated and how policies are changed, they do need better information and better indicators than they have now. Because as I think many folks here have seen, if you just sort of take, well, here's how many apprehensions or encounters on the border we have now, and say, okay, well, let's overlay some scenarios. If it increases as much as this year, it'll go up by this much. But if it drops as much as this year, it'll go down this much, and then maybe you had like a seasonal variation. That's not that informative. And it particularly isn't useful, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, right, as you're thinking about budgeting cycles. So this question of how you get better data about migration is very much open. And one last thing, sorry, I'm going on about this a little bit, but the last thing is that figuring out how you actually really incorporate relevant data from sending and transit countries is the sort of the biggest missing piece of this, in my perception. How do you actually figure out, like, when people are moving through Panama, and what that, how that's, how these shifts are happening?
Yeah. Well, so it sounds like you're a little skeptical of sort of the gaming out scenarios, right? In terms of trying to be predictive. We're not quite there yet, or don't quite sort of have a handle on that. And it sounds like baked into what you're saying is that sort of the best way we can utilize data at this point is also sort of looking back at scenarios we've dealt with, and trying to see what we can possibly learn from scenarios that have already played out. I wonder if there are some examples that come to mind to you that might be good to sort of look at in that regard. I know in an earlier conversation we had, you mentioned an example with a sort of mini surge of Indian Sikhs in 2011, I think it was, or thereabouts.
Yeah, so I think what is limiting in a lot of these is that if you're just looking at what's happened in the past, you're looking at primarily Mexican migration, and then you're looking at Central American migration over the last 8 years, but that wouldn't have, none of those would have been predictively useful in figuring out Venezuelan migration in 2022, because it's largely a new phenomenon, right? We had, over the past the past decade or so, we've known that lots and lots of Venezuelans were being displaced from their home, and they were moving around largely South America, but they weren't coming to the United States. And now they're starting to, right now we are seeing significant numbers of people arriving, and it's not totally clear why. It's not just a strict cause and effect, right? People want to leave Venezuela and they show up at the Southwest border. There are other things going on. And to the example that you mentioned, so in 2011 there was this minor surge. It was a few thousand people, but it was of Indian nationals arriving in the Southwest border, and they were claiming asylum protections, and they were all using the exact same story. They were saying they were Sikhs and they'd been persecuted because it was all, the exact same story. It was they had been married to someone from another religion, and they were persecuted in their community, and they would meet the CIS credible fear threshold, and then were put into the immigration court process. And at the time, this was before a lot of the huge surges of Central American migrants in the Southwest border. So it was sort of almost an oddity. Everyone watched it closely, but it was pretty clearly some sort of human smuggling network. I think when they traced it back into India, this company had billboards, travel to the United States, no visa needed, which in a way was true. And so I think what is important to bear in mind is that the model that we're seeing right now, where migrants essentially scrape together money or use debt to pay a smuggler to get to the United States, then have to repay the smuggler with their earnings once they arrive, and where they're where they're moved through human smuggling networks and where they claim humanitarian protections, that is, to this point, mostly been Central American. Now we're seeing some other South American migrants, certain populations, Caribbean populations. But that model can scale. We don't know how much it can scale to people in other parts of the world who could potentially, afford or be able to go into debt for a plane flight into Mexico or Guatemala or Panama. We don't really know. We know lots and lots of people would like to have access, would like to be able to come to the United States, but really, the fact that people might be able to use a pathway but haven't used it yet doesn't mean, of course, that they're not going to. And so I think it's very possible that we could see very different kinds of migrants arriving and presenting different challenges. So the kind of migrants that are right now crossing the Mediterranean on boats, or other kinds of groups arriving at the Southwest border. And so I think what is while it's, I don't know, I wouldn't want to make a prediction for whether Libyans are going to start arriving in the United States in the future. Who knows? But I think what we can do now very much is figure out, well, what actually would that mean? What would these scenarios mean on the Southwest border? Where are the gaps in our policy processes or our abilities to process these different populations? What would it mean if we had lots more people arriving who we weren't able to return? Where would they go? Would they wait in Mexico? Would they wait somewhere else? What would they be? Would we provide resources to create some kind of safe zone where they could wait in Mexico? Or would it be something where we just say, this is the Mexican government or the Guatemalan government's problem? They just get stopped as they're starting to move across. Those are all, I think, very much open questions and should be addressed. And these are the kind of things that I think it's valuable to think about right now.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned, fees paid to smugglers and so forth. We're talking about what's become a massive industry, right? Billions of dollars sort of put into that sort of black market, if you will. And you spoke to the fact that there are some migrants who can't afford to do that, right? And those are the people that are really left out of this conversation. But I think the fact that you do have such a large illicit industry demonstrates that there are some resources that could be put into a legitimate industry of processing. Again, sort of going back to the regional processing center idea, fees and so forth could in some cases be manageable for migrants and a much better use of resources, a much safer use of resources. No?
Yeah, I think we have this sort of surprising unintended consequence of the level of border security investment on the Southwest border, where it's almost becoming, if you're actually going to evade apprehension on the Southwest border, you have to hire now a skilled guide, and it's becoming, it's reaching the kind of prices that it used to be if you wanted to get taken to Canada on a ship, and then smuggled across the border. the costs we're seeing, the amount of money we're seeing people start to pay on the southwest border are much, much, much higher than it was, even like 2011 or something like that. And so, yeah, it's supporting a much more sophisticated human smuggling network, and it is enabling people to go farther distances. And we don't really know where it ends, but you're right, it's become a real industry, and one where smugglers are much more sophisticated, and so it's just not clear how much more this could scale, but it could be a lot, and I think that's really worth thinking through. Yeah.
Do you have any sense of, in terms of that scale that we've already seen in terms of what people are paying? Can you put any specs on that, or at least any estimates from your work in terms of what we see in terms of fees people are paying?
Yeah, from Central America, you'll hear estimates like in the $7,000+ range. You for other places, I think when Indian nationals were arriving in 2011, those people were getting tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, right, they're $30,000 more to be smuggled, and so it varies quite a bit. But I think the numbers are going up, and you have a large amount of that is involved in payoffs along the way to different organizations. And so you're dealing with these very these organizations that want to capitalize on it, right? They're very entrepreneurial, and so as the numbers go up, they have a big incentive to try and extract more and more of the cost that are being paid by migrants.
Yeah. Well, and you've mentioned asylum a few times, and I realize that's sort of its own topic and can of worms, but just even this sort of aspect, it'd be good to hear you talk about it in terms of how use of that system has grown exponentially in the last decade. I think last decade up over 400% in terms of claims. And so maybe talk about that and how things sort of get shoehorned into that, right? And how we might sort of, if you see any ways for people, for us to sort of de-incentivize that approach that we see so many migrants take.
Yeah, so it's almost become, the asylum system has become almost a separate immigration system on the southwest border. And I think for a lot of migrants, it's really their only viable path to living in the United States, but certainly for a lot of Central Americans and some other countries, because the legal pathways are slow and there are country caps, right? And they a lot of these processes are forbidding people to know the resources, but but the asylum system is broadly, right now, because it's so overwhelmed, if you can get to the United States, if you meet certain demographic criteria and are enabled to go through an immigration court process, that process is so backed up that you'd be in the United States for years, right? I mean, immigration court hearings now are famously 5 years out, more sometimes, right? And so, what we've seen is that a process that is important. People who are, people need to be able to make claims of humanitarian protection, and the asylum system, really, comes from, largely the modern asylum system comes from sort of post-World War recognition, that the things that happened, like boats full of Jewish refugees being turned away and returned to Europe, was terrible and can't happen again. So, there clearly does need to be a way for people who physically arrive in the US to make some kind of claim for protections. But what we see now is that on the southwest border specifically, the ability of people to travel there in much, much higher numbers than they have in the past, and then make those claims, plus the fact that the system is so backed up, has created what is effectively an informal, it's not informal because it deals with government processes, but it's created an alternative migration system that is disorderly, and where people can stay in the United States for a large amounts of time without really having any kind of official status, and then can basically hope that either there will be some kind of change in the laws later, or there'll be some sort of change in enforcement priorities, and they won't be removed. And largely that's often the case. So we've created a system with really, or not, we haven't created, we've allowed a system to be created with all kinds of really sort of the wrong incentives. It's not anything that I think almost anyone across the political spectrum would want, but that's what we have now. And I think it is important to recognize that the asylum system needs to be reformed without violating sort of our basic obligations to have, access to humanitarian protection for the folks who need it the most. And that's where I think we need to think a little creatively and get beyond the existing approaches we've used.
Yeah. Well, I think that our initial conversation that you and I had several months ago about regional processing centers is one of those creative ideas. And I encourage all of our viewers to check out what we call our strategic inquiry, number 6, that we looked at that idea, because I think it is a really good one. And Ben has a lot of good input in that essay in terms of that idea, in terms of de-incentivizing these dangerous journeys that people make that overwhelm our system, and provide an alternative way of processing things in a sort of cooperative manner that takes some of the pressure off of the US and helps us build regional partnerships. Ben, I think we're out of time, and I'm so grateful to you for giving us your perspective today on this topic, and I hope we see you again soon.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
All right, be well. Take care, everyone.